A lone cowboy alone for years, until a hanged girl breathed in his arms. The wind howled through the empty plains, carrying with it the scent of dust and the promise of more solitude. Jack sat on his porch, staring at the horizon, the vast expanse of the prairies stretching out before him. His small ranch, a modest patch of land nestled among the hills, was all he had left. Years of hard work had worn him down, and the land seemed as tired as he was. It wasn't the kind of place where someone could find peace, but it was the only life Jack knew. For years he had lived alone, with nothing but the company of his cattle and the occasional visit from the few remaining townsfolk. His ranch had once been a place of laughter, a place full of life. But that was before his wife had passed away. Her death had broken him. He had always known that life was tough, but it hadn't prepared him for the kind of grief that left you empty, hollow inside, as though all the warmth had been sucked out of you. He couldn't even bring himself to sell the land or leave the ranch. It was all he had left of her, and leaving would have meant losing everything. Over time, Jack had withdrawn from the world. The memories of better days still lingered, but they were painful to hold on to. He kept his distance from people, afraid of getting close again, only to have them leave. He didn't want to feel that way again. So he lived in silence, day after day, tending to his chores. He had his horses and cattle to care for, and that was enough to fill his time. Or so he thought. It was the quiet that bothered him the most. The silence of the night was oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He could hear the wind, but there were no voices, no footsteps. He didn't know if he was waiting for something, or if he was simply too tired to care anymore. It had been years since he had felt truly alive, and the weight of loneliness pressed down on him every single day. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a brilliant orange, Jack was out by the barn, repairing a broken fence. His hands moved methodically, though his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just working to keep the day from slipping into the dark. But the sound of a horse's hooves approaching caught his attention. It wasn't the regular sound of a rider, the familiar rhythm of the townfolk, or the occasional traveler passing through. This was different. It was hurried, urgent. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He dropped the hammer he was holding and stood up, squinting into the distance. At first he thought he might be imagining things, but the figure riding toward him grew clearer. It was a young woman, riding a horse at full gallop, her long hair flying behind her like a dark cloud in the wind. As she drew closer, Jack saw the fear in her eyes. She didn't stop or slow down. She rode straight for him, the horse kicking up dust behind her. Jack froze for a moment, unsure of what was happening, but something in her expression urged him to move. The young woman reached him in seconds, pulling the horse to a sudden stop. Her breathing was heavy, her eyes wide with panic. She was a stranger, and yet there was something in her face that made Jack's heart race. "Please, help me," she gasped, almost pleading, before collapsing from the saddle into his arms. Jack's instincts took over. He caught her and held her steady, feeling her small body trembling in his grasp. Her skin was cold to the touch, and her eyes fluttered open for a moment before closing again. She was clearly exhausted, drenched in sweat and covered in dirt. Jack's heart pounded, and he immediately pulled her closer, trying to steady her. "Hold on," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. He looked around, unsure of where to go or what to do, but the thought of leaving her out in the open made his stomach turn. He wasn't sure who she was or what she had been through, but he couldn't just let her go. Without thinking, Jack lifted her carefully into his arms. his muscles straining under her weight. His mind raced as he carried her into the small house, his thoughts a blur. The door creaked open, and he made his way through the front room, barely pausing to set her down on the old, worn-out couch by the fire. As he stepped back to assess the situation, Jack could see how badly the girl was trembling. Her breath was shallow, and her face was pale. He didn't know if she was injured or just overcome with exhaustion, but something told him she needed help. Quickly, he hurried to the water pump outside, filling a bucket and rushing back into the house. He soaked a cloth and gently placed it on her forehead. The girl didn't stir, but at least her breathing seemed a little steadier. Jack's mind raced. Who was this girl? Why was she so terrified? And why had she come to him? His own heart was racing now, his thoughts filled with 1,000 questions. He hadn't expected this, not after so many years of solitude. There had been no sign that anyone would come, let alone someone so young and desperate. But Jack's attention quickly shifted to the girl. She was breathing, but barely. He needed to know more. He couldn't just leave her alone like this. Time seemed to slow as he sat beside her, waiting for any sign that she might wake up. His eyes never left her face, the lines of worry creasing his brow. What was her story? What had led her here, to this place of safety, only to find herself at the brink of collapse? The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin, all was quiet. Jack had been alone for so long, but now, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. The girl had come to him for a reason, but what that reason was, he couldn't yet understand. As the night stretched on, Jack stayed by her side, his heart heavy with the weight of an unknown future. But one thing was certain. This night had changed everything. No longer was he the solitary cowboy, lost in his own grief. Something had shifted, and Jack couldn't help but feel that he was on the edge of a new beginning, one that would take him down a path he hadn't walked in a long time. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't sure what to expect, but he couldn't deny the pull to protect this stranger, to help her find the safety and solace she had clearly been searching for. And maybe, just maybe, he might find something in himself again that he had long buried. The hours passed in silence, but Jack stayed close, his thoughts focused on the girl and the mystery that surrounded her. The night was quiet, but Jack couldn't rest. He sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, his mind racing. The girl was asleep, though her breathing still sounded shallow, her chest rising and falling with a slow rhythm. Jack had done what he could, covering her with a warm blanket, but he knew the worst wasn't over. She needed more than just rest. She needed answers. The hours passed slowly, the fire crackling softly, but Jack was too restless to sleep. He kept glancing over at the girl. Her face, though pale and weary, seemed peaceful now. She didn't stir, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for her. He hadn't expected this kind of life, this kind of trouble, to find him after so many years of being alone. But here she was, a stranger in desperate need of help. The storm outside had passed, leaving the air cold and crisp. The wind had died down, and the quiet seemed even more intense now. Jack finally stood up, pacing around the room, trying to think clearly. He knew he had to find out who she was and what had happened to her, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. She had been through something. He could tell that much. But what? And why had she come to him? He walked over to the small window, peering out at the moonlit landscape. The ranch was isolated, a long way from the nearest town, and he had no idea if anyone would be able to help. He could go into town tomorrow, ask around, see if anyone knew anything about the girl. But that would mean leaving her alone. and he wasn't sure if he was ready to do that just yet. The night seemed to stretch on forever as Jack stood by the window, lost in thought. He had lived most of his life in silence, keeping to himself, avoiding the world outside. His wife's death had made him pull away even more, but this girl, this stranger, had brought a new kind of chaos into his quiet life. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a soft moan. He turned quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. The girl was stirring now, her eyelids fluttering as if she were coming out of a deep sleep. Jack stepped closer, his hand hovering just over her shoulder, unsure whether he should wake her or let her rest. Her eyes slowly opened, and for a moment she just stared at him, her gaze empty and distant, as if she didn't recognize where she was. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and he took a careful step back, giving her space. "Hey, are you okay?" Jack's voice was gentle, almost hesitant. The girl blinked, her expression still dazed, as if she couldn't quite process the world around her. She took a slow, shaky breath, then tried to sit up, her hands gripping the blanket tightly as if she were bracing herself. Jack rushed to her side, but she pulled away, shaking her head weakly. Her voice was barely a whisper, and she paused, as if gathering the strength to speak. "I don't know where I am." "You're safe," Jack said quietly. "You're at my place. You were hurt, but you're all right now." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face for some sign of truth. Jack could see the confusion and fear in her eyes, but there was something else there too, a quiet desperation. It was as though she were trying to remember something important. Her brow furrowed, and she opened her mouth again, but no words came out. "Take it slow," Jack said gently. "You don't have to say anything yet." The girl's breath hitched as if she were struggling to hold back tears. Jack felt a wave of sympathy wash over him, but he didn't know how to comfort her. He wasn't good with words, and the more he tried to reassure her, the more it seemed like she was slipping away again, retreating into herself. She closed her eyes, as if trying to block out the pain that had overwhelmed her moments earlier. Jack sat back down on the edge of the chair, watching her closely. He had to know more, had to understand what had brought this girl to his doorstep in the first place. "Can you remember your name?" Jack asked softly, his voice quiet, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile moment they were sharing. The girl hesitated for a long time, her fingers twitching at the edge of the blanket. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily." "My name's Emily." Jack nodded. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but her name felt like a small victory, a thread he could hold on to. Emily was alive, and that was the most important thing. But the question remained: what had happened to her? What kind of life had she lived before this moment? "Emily, I don't know what happened to you, but you're safe here," Jack said, his voice steady but soft. "I don't know if you're running from something, but I'll help you however I can." Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak. She just stared at him, her lips trembling as if she were on the verge of saying something, but the words never came. Jack stood up again, pacing the room as he tried to make sense of everything. Emily had clearly been through something terrible, but she was still alive, still here, and that was a small miracle in itself. The questions would come later, when she was ready to talk. For now, Jack needed to focus on helping her heal. He went to the small cabinet, pulling out some simple food, a bit of bread and cheese, and set it on the table next to her. "You should eat something. It'll help you feel better." Emily didn't move at first, but when she glanced at the food, her stomach let out a soft growl. She looked at Jack, and for the first time since waking up, her expression softened, just a little. She reached out, her hands trembling as she picked up a piece of bread, breaking it into smaller bits. Jack watched her closely, waiting for her to say something, anything, but the silence stretched on. "I don't know what happened," Emily said suddenly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know why I was there. I don't even know how I got here." Jack sat down across from her, his hands resting on the table, watching her with quiet understanding. He didn't press her for more information. Not yet. She had been through enough. The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and he could tell she was still trying to make sense of it all. "I'll help you figure it out," Jack said softly. "But for now, you're safe. That's what matters." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She wiped her cheek quickly, but Jack had already seen it. The weight of whatever had brought her here was still there, and it was something she wasn't ready to talk about yet. Jack didn't push her, though. Instead, he simply waited, offering her the one thing he could give her: his silence, his patience, and his willingness to help her rebuild whatever had been broken. For now, that was all he could offer. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, and Jack found himself slipping back into a routine he had not followed in years. It was a simple life, but it was one he had grown used to. He spent his mornings checking on the animals, making sure the cattle were fed and the fences were intact. The afternoons were spent working around the ranch, fixing what needed fixing, and keeping the place in order. But now, things felt different. There was a presence in the house, a quiet energy that wasn't there before. Emily's presence, though subtle, filled the space in ways Jack hadn't expected. At first, Emily had been distant, lost in her own thoughts, and sometimes he caught her staring out the window as if searching for something just beyond her reach. She had only spoken a few words, and Jack had learned not to push her for more. He didn't want to force her to relive whatever had happened to her. Her mind, Jack knew, was still working through things she didn't fully understand herself. The first morning after she woke up, Jack had offered her food, but she barely touched it. Her hands trembled, and her eyes were dull, as if she were seeing everything through a fog. Jack respected her space, but he also knew she needed help, needed to know she wasn't alone. He had been alone for so long, and the thought of someone else, someone who needed care, made him feel something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. As the days passed, Emily began to eat a little more, drink a little more. She never said much, but Jack could see small changes in her. Her gaze wasn't as lost as it had been in the beginning. When she smiled, though it was a rare thing, it felt genuine, as though something in her was slowly coming back to life. And that gave Jack hope, though he wasn't sure what kind of hope it was. He hadn't allowed himself to feel anything for a long time, but now, with Emily here, everything seemed to stir inside him. One afternoon, after finishing his chores, Jack came back into the house to find Emily sitting by the window, looking out at the vast expanse of the prairie. She hadn't moved much since he'd left, but there was something different about her today. She wasn't just staring into the distance, she was watching something, though Jack couldn't tell what. "Hey," Jack said softly, not wanting to startle her. "How are you feeling?" Emily didn't answer right away. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, the wind lightly stirring the curtains. Jack wasn't sure if she heard him, but he waited. There was no rush. After a long pause, Emily spoke, her voice quiet and almost hesitant. "I keep thinking I should remember something important, but it's like it's just out of reach." Jack nodded, sitting down across from her. He didn't know what she meant, but he understood the feeling of trying to grasp something that always seemed just beyond your fingers. "It'll come to you when you're ready," he said gently. You don't have to remember everything right now. You're safe here." She turned toward him slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time in days. There was a flicker of something in her expression. Hope, maybe? It was hard to tell, but Jack knew one thing for sure. She needed time. More than anything, she needed time to heal, and Jack, for all his own wounds, was willing to give it to her. "Do you think I'm safe here?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "No one's going to hurt you here. You don't have to worry about that." There was silence for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that felt like a small understanding, a mutual agreement without words. Emily seemed to relax a little, her shoulders loosening, though her hands remained tense in her lap. Jack could see she was still holding on to something, some fear or anxiety that she hadn't shared. But that was fine. He wasn't going to push her. The next few days were more of the same. Emily would eat a little more each day, and Jack would spend his time fixing things around the house or taking care of the animals. The work didn't stop, and neither did the quiet. But with Emily around, it felt less empty, less lonely. There was a sense of purpose in everything he did now. Every task seemed more important, more meaningful. He wasn't just working for himself anymore. He was working for someone else, someone who needed him. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jack went out to the barn to take care of the horses. Emily had started helping around the house more, though she never ventured far from the porch or the windows. She would watch Jack work, and sometimes he would catch her looking at the open land, her eyes lost in thought. Jack didn't mind the silence. It was more comfortable now. He could sense that Emily was beginning to trust him, little by little. That evening, after the chores were done, Jack sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from orange to pink, then to dark blue. The stars began to twinkle above him, and for a moment he forgot about the pain in his chest, the emptiness that had lingered for so long. He hadn't realized how much he had missed this, the simple act of sitting and looking at the stars. Emily came outside and sat down beside him without saying a word. Jack glanced at her, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking up at the sky, her eyes scanning the stars. There was a stillness about her, a quiet that Jack found peaceful, yet deeply sad. "Do you ever wonder what's out there?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice soft and tentative. Jack turned to look at her, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "Out there," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the sky. "Beyond the stars. Do you think there's anything more than this? Or is it all just empty?" Jack thought for a moment, the question weighing on him. He had spent most of his life thinking that the world was just a small, lonely place. He had convinced himself that there was nothing beyond the ranch, beyond the endless plains. But now, with Emily here, he wasn't so sure. She had asked a question that had never really occurred to him, had never mattered to him. Until now. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've never thought much about it. But maybe there's more to this world than we can see. Maybe there's more to life than just surviving." Emily didn't say anything else, but Jack could tell that her mind was working, thinking, processing. It was the first real conversation they had had about anything other than survival, and it felt like a breakthrough, even if it was small. It was something. The next morning, Emily seemed different. She had a quiet resolve in her eyes, as if she had made a decision. Jack didn't ask her about it. He just let her be, giving her the space she needed. But he knew deep down that something had shifted inside her. She was beginning to find herself again, even if she didn't fully understand what that meant yet. And Jack, for the first time in years, felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. The days had grown warmer as the spring took hold of the land. The prairie, which had once seemed barren and desolate, was now alive with color. Flowers bloomed in patches of green, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh earth. Jack had always found comfort in the rhythm of nature, in the seasons changing, in the work that never ceased. But this time, with Emily by his side, it felt different. It felt like a new chapter, though neither of them had said so out loud. Emily had started to help more around the ranch, doing small tasks that Jack had once done alone. She fed the chickens, swept the porch, and even started to help with the garden. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Every day she seemed to grow a little stronger, her movements less hesitant, her eyes less distant. Jack noticed the changes, even if Emily didn't. She was beginning to trust him little by little, but there was still a distance between them, one that neither of them could cross just yet. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, Jack was in the barn, checking on the horses. The weather had left the ground soggy, and the air smelled fresh, but the work had piled up. The fence by the far corner had been damaged by the storm, and Jack knew he would need to fix it before it got any worse. He was trying to figure out the best way to handle it when Emily walked into the barn, carrying a basket of tools. She stood there for a moment, watching him as he worked, before walking up to him. "I can help you with that," she said, her voice steady and clear. Jack looked up, surprised by her offer. Emily had always been a little reluctant to join him in the harder tasks, but today something was different. Her face held a new determination, a quiet strength that he hadn't seen before. "Are you sure?" Jack asked, his tone warm but cautious. She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I'm sure. I've been watching you work. I think I can manage." Jack set down his tools and gave her a nod of approval. "All right, let's get to it then." He handed her a hammer and a few nails, showing her the basics of what needed to be done. They worked side by side in silence, the only sounds being the rhythmic thud of the hammer against the wood and the occasional soft wind blowing through the open barn doors. Emily's movements were a little awkward at first, but Jack could see the concentration in her face. She was trying, and that was all that mattered. As they worked, Jack couldn't help but notice the change in her. She wasn't the frightened, distant girl who had stumbled onto his porch just a few weeks ago. She was growing into someone else, someone stronger, more capable. They spent the morning fixing the fence, and by the time the sun was high in the sky, the job was done. Sweat glistened on their brows, but there was a sense of satisfaction between them, an unspoken understanding. When they finished, Jack looked at Emily and smiled. "You did a good job," he said, his voice proud. Emily smiled back, a small, quiet smile that made Jack's heart flutter. It wasn't much, but it meant everything. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And that, to Jack, was the biggest change of all. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emily spoke more than she had in days. She didn't talk about her past, but she shared things that Jack hadn't known. She told him about the small joys she had experienced before everything changed, about the time she had felt free, happy even. She talked about her favorite memories from her childhood, when she had lived in a small house with a garden full of roses. Her words were soft, almost wistful, as though she were speaking about a life long gone. Jack listened intently, not interrupting, just letting her speak. It was the first time in weeks that Emily had opened up in such a way. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward, and Jack knew that each small step she took was a victory, one that was hard won. As the evening deepened, the conversation shifted, and Emily became quieter again. She looked out at the horizon, her expression thoughtful. Jack couldn't help but wonder what was going on in her mind. But he didn't ask. He had learned that sometimes it was better to let people work through things on their own. "I don't know what's next," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what happens now." Jack didn't answer right away. He knew what she meant. She had come to his ranch a stranger, lost and broken. Now she was healing, but the future still seemed uncertain. Jack understood that uncertainty better than anyone. It was the feeling that had followed him around for years, the feeling that life could change at any moment, without warning. "What do you want to do?" Jack asked gently. Emily turned her gaze back to him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just know I can't stay in the past. I have to move forward." Jack nodded slowly, understanding more than she knew. He had spent so many years looking back, letting the past haunt him, that he had forgotten how to move forward. But now, with Emily, he was beginning to understand. Sometimes it wasn't about knowing the future. It was about taking things one step at a time, trusting that the next step would lead you somewhere new. "Moving forward can be hard," Jack said quietly, "but it's the only way to keep going." Emily didn't respond right away, but she seemed to understand what he meant. She turned her gaze back to the horizon, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. Jack didn't press her for more. She would find her way in her own time. The days continued to pass, and Emily grew stronger, more confident. She helped Jack around the ranch, learning new tasks, taking on responsibilities that she had never imagined herself doing. But more than that, she was finding her voice, the part of herself that had been buried for so long. And Jack was beginning to see something in her that he hadn't noticed before. Courage. Emily wasn't just surviving anymore.